Hi everyone and welcome. I'm Glenn Diesen and I'm joined today by Alexander Mercouris and Alastair Crooke, everyone's favorite British diplomat and analyst on the Middle East. We're really seeing some very extreme escalations now in Ukraine. NATO's appeared to cross new red lines, but we also see that Russia has used several ways of retaliating, such as the Oreshnik missile. But I thought we could first start by addressing the changing situation in the Middle East. And perhaps we could start with you, Alistair, in terms of what is happening. Can you tell us about Israel's war now with its neighbors, the ceasefire with Lebanon, will it hold? And I guess we can also address Netanyahu's position within Israel, but perhaps begin with the actual war.
And perhaps also this attack on Aleppo. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, okay. First of all, I would say, this is a long war. So what we're seeing at the moment is basically shape-shifting. It's just changing its shape and it's moving from here to there and may move back again, or it moves somewhere quite different. It's not, I don't think we're coming to anywhere near the end anyway for some while ahead. So yes, first of all, there is the ceasefire in Lebanon, which I suppose is the first thing that everyone sort of starts from at this point. The ceasefire seems to be working so far, unless there's been sort of breaking news, but seems to be okay. But it's a truce, not a ceasefire. And I think that for the moment that is sufficient. I think, what are the reasons for the ceasefire? I think there are several from the Israeli point of view. I think a principal one is really that their military force is overstretched, is tired. More than tired, exhausted. But they're operating about 20% below the level of manpower they need to fulfill the current orders that they have. If you like, the military requirements placed on the army, they're only about 80%. And there is a big drop-off in reservists who are turning up for duty and who are willing to serve at this point. Some of them have become alienated and have dropped out. And so they haven't been fighting, for example, in Lebanon. The reservists, they pulled them out. And the Golani, which is the main brigade up there, has suffered huge casualties. So I think it's one element of it is casualties, heavy casualties in Lebanon, very heavy casualties in Lebanon. More injuries perhaps than deaths, but still high casualties, exhaustion, the army becoming quite obstreperous against the government. You'll have seen they had protests against the government when Gallant was sacked. But I think there's another element, which is maybe two elements, which is just important. One is the coalition, because it's becoming increasingly difficult to justify, particularly even to the religious nationalist part of the coalition, the idea that it's all right for one segment of society to suffer huge casualties and deaths, to send their sons off to be killed in the sort of secular, more Ashkenazi part of the army, and that the Haredi, the Orthodox, are still exempt. And this was becoming such an issue of the disparity as these casualties rise, that one sector of the population was supposed to have their sons die, and the other one was completely exempt from it. And this was threatening to bring down the coalition. It was becoming a very great source of friction within the cabinet, and could bring down. So I think a very important element in the decision was to secure the coalition. and to stop it failing over this issue of conscription of the Orthodox. Then, according to the Hebrew press reading it today, also the Americans were, if you like, holding back certain JDAM munitions. Biden was. And part of the deal for the ceasefire was that these would be released. These additional weapons that Israel has asked for would be released. I suppose there's also an element, but I don't necessarily think that Netanyahu would do it solely for this reason, but probably also he wanted to start clearing the decks for Trump, for his main task, which is to persuade Trump to join Israel in a war on Iran. And that's much more important to him even than Lebanon. So I think those are the sort of reasons for it. How long it'll last, well, we just have to wait and see. And so, of course, the war sort of comes to a truce in one part and then starts in Syria in another part. And this is going to be quite a troublesome thing, I believe. What it goes back to is something that Erdogan has been saying for really from the 10th of this month. But he's talked about the war. Sorry, I just got something in my eye. He's talked about the war.
Do you want to take some time off to deal with it? If you want, Alastair, we're recording, so there's not a problem.
I think it's not really we've got the wind up today because there's a depression over Athens. The Greeks are in trouble here.
I know all about depressions in Athens, and I also know all about problems with eyes. So there it is. So,
okay, let's go on. So some days ago, Erdogan was saying, we're in a new strategic area. Borders are changing. Land is being taken. Peoples are being slaughtered in preparation for the arrival of Trump from the 20th of January. And so Erdogan was saying, we have to do our part. Turkey has to do our part of this and take advantage of this situation. And we need to have a major military operation. And the major military operation in Idlib is essentially being run by the Turkish intelligence. And they are using large numbers. They've mobilized a large number from Idlib, from HTS, which was the sort of a repackaged of Al Qaeda, but was trained both by the Americans and by the Turks. Now, what he's trying to do is he says that he wants to protect Turks' borders, but by taking Syrian and Iraqi land. So he's talking even about having a buffer zone going from the Mediterranean to Iran, crossing across northern Syria, taking a slice out of northern Syria and to the northeast and arriving at Iran. Primarily, he says, to stop the Kurds coming in and causing trouble in Turkey. The Kurds, of course, are not in Idlib, but the Turkish population is very sensitive about the prospect that if Syria comes together at some point as a state, that there are a lot of potential refugees about to come to Turkey. And the Turkish people are adamant that they don't want them. So he is pursuing really a sort of attempt to carve out Idlib to make it a sort of protectorate under Turkish control in Idlib. I mean, and then to create a buffer zone in the northeast And Assad is adamant that Syria has to be a single state, and that it's not, and he will not allow this. So Erdogan is doing this, and it's also designed as a sort of secondary, or maybe primary objective as well. Now is to please the Americans and to please Trump coming in, because he recalls actually Trump stopped him when he tried to make I think it was, I can't remember, 2019 or something, when Erdogan wanted to have a larger buffer zone in northeast Syria. He stepped in. Trump stepped in and sent his Pence to stop it and to tell Erdogan he couldn't do it. This was at the time I think Trump was thinking of withdrawing all the troops, and Erdogan was messing it up. But I think he does. And I do notice the Turks are also trying to resurrect their F-35 contract with the Americans. Though why on earth they should want to do it? It's such a useless aircraft. I mean, it's sort of, you have to have 55% are only in service usually at one time. The others are requiring maintenance and work on them to keep them flying. Anyway, he wants to buy them. So a complex thing, and he's going to sell it, of course, to Trump by saying he's cutting the supply lines, the weapons supply lines of Iran and Hezbollah. And at bottom of it, you know, this is a move against Iran and against Russia in the complicated world of Turkish politics, in the way, you know, we've heard him being very loud and vociferous about his support for the Palestinian cause and how everyone should support it, and yet the oil still flows from Azerbaijan through the pipelines Kahan to Israel. And it's important. It's about, I think, 40% of Israeli oil goes through that route. And Erdogan has not raised a finger to stop that or some of the other corridor system going into Israel, even as he's been making these speeches and huge crowds in Turkey and sounding very nationalist in support of the Palestinians.
Two questions. Firstly, about Israel. Did they underestimate Hezbollah? I mean, I got very much the impression when they started the campaign against Hezbollah that they thought if they could decapitate the leadership of Hezbollah, kill Nasrallah, kill the man who succeeded him, launch all the pages, all of this, that the whole thing would come collapsing down like a house of cards. It's not the first time that the Israelis have underestimated their adversary. I've been hearing very contradictory things about the fighting, but it doesn't seem as if they actually even captured a single village in Lebanon, if that is true.
That's correct.
Did they underestimate Hezbollah? Yeah. So that they did. Well,
this is, I mean, really, in a sort of sense, it's a cultural thing, a wide cultural thing. I mean, for a long time, I mean, Israel has been convinced, and it's a view often shared by America too, you know, that if you just take out the top person, then everything crumbles, and then it's, you know, leaderless, and it just disappears. But I was in Lebanon for the 2006 war throughout, and at the end of because I was writing about it during it, and at the end of it, rather in a unusual way, because they never normally do this, I was taken to the south and I met the commanders, the Hezbollah military commanders. They never let the military usually talk to anyone. I've never written that part of it exactly, but I will say this about it. It was astonishing. They were very young. They were 21, something like that, most of the commanders. They were so professional, so well trained. They knew exactly what they were doing. And they had a different sort of concept of fighting. from the one that we're taught. I asked them, what is the main thing you learn when when you're a young officer? And they answered, philosophy. And I thought, you'll never get that from Sandhurst or a military college, that they studied philosophy. But they do it for the reason of psychology, that you need to be able to, the philosophical approach allowed you to deal with the, if you like, the exaltation of victory and the depths of depression when things go against you, and to maintain a long balance. And so it was about keeping the morale and it well established. And the other thing that I asked them was, well, how do you choose your leaders? What is the quality for that? And none of the West system of have you done this course? Tick a box. Have you done this course? Tick a box. Have you qualified this? They said, no, we look for people who can spin a magic web over men. That's what we seek. Someone who can draw them in and they will follow even to death. My point, sorry, is not drifting off into 2006, but my point is these were 21 then. That was about 20 years ago, nearly 20 years ago. They're in their 40s and 50s. Since then, they've had huge experience in Syria and against the jihadists. Hard, hand-to-hand fighting. And they're in their prime. Much more experience than when they were 21. Much more understanding of of that sort of war. And the other thing that is important to understand, and I mean, of course, there was a huge setback. People felt it when the whole leadership was killed unexpectedly like that. And then more of Safieddine followed on, the heir presumptive. So, I mean, there was a time, but first of all, the military wing was never connected to those pagers and the walkie-talkies. That was basically for the civilian structures in Hezbollah, that you go into Dahia, the suburb of Beirut where they're in control, and, there are police, security, national civil defense, rescue, hospital services and all these things. They need pagers, they need walkie-talkies, but the military run entirely on fiber optics. And they were deeply aware of the dangers even before 2006, because the Senora administration was always trying to cut their communications or to put them under control of servers and systems that were mostly under Israeli surveillance. So they then just built their own fiber network. And the other thing is that even then, and that has been a model that has been there and has been extended to Iran, even then the aim was that you had autonomous units, not so large, but autonomous units. And they were ordered, first of all, to prepare successors, each one of them. And secondly, plans so that they could continue the war for 2 years, even if all communications cut and the headquarters was totally eliminated. And that they were able to operate by working with if you like, their counterparts in the next areas and the next areas in a sort of bottom-up, if you like, network structure, even though there was no communication from headquarters, they could continue in that basis. So, I mean, you can understand now I'm saying all of this fitted in, and this is why they were able to regroup quickly. And they had been planning and preparing for this for some years. how to do it and changed their operational mode quite considerably. And yes, I mean, the Israelis got nowhere. I mean, they didn't even get 2 kilometers into it. They did not reach the Litani. And in some of these cases, they came in, like when they went and sat themselves next to the Irish UNIFIL grouping, the UN peacekeepers grouping there. They went in, they brought in the head of Shin Bet, they took photographs of themselves, and then out they went. They weren't going to stay around. So yes, they underestimated the cost. And even the Golani have been decimated there, really decimated. So ambushes, operations, and just as an anecdote at the end, suddenly, because of what I've told you, it won't surprise you, but suddenly families are finding that, a group of 17 that they'd lost contact with and everything and thought might be dead have suddenly emerged, and they were fine, and they've been fighting all along. And they just gone on fighting with no communication. And suddenly the family was, I mean, it's happened several things. With suddenly the family finds that all their men are coming home, and they've just been quietly going on fighting with no communication.
Why did Hezbollah agree to a ceasefire? I mean, was it because they never actually wanted this battle in the first place, or do they have some other reason?
Well, it touches on something that I did say to you about having a sort of philosophical view, and it's a little bit like, if you like, a parallel to make it understandable would be like the Russians. The Russians are never. I think you probably already said this a number of times in your programs. Probably, the Russians, don't care about territory.
Yeah.
I mean, if it suits them, they'll retreat, and then, the main thing is, what is the main objective? And the main objective for Hezbollah is a long attrition of Israel, not just to have a defeat of the Golani in southern Lebanon. And just to be clear, because some people say, oh, well, they were in this village or something. The only villages that they really were able to occupy in Lebanon are the ones that the SLA, that was South Lebanese Army, that was an Israeli proxy force that was in Lebanon in 2006, and then all had to flee the country. But there were certain well-known villages, one or two of them on the border, whose sympathy lay with Israel. And the Israelis went into those, of course, made straight for those villages. But they never got beyond sort of 2 kilometers into Lebanon.
I wanted to ask you what you said about Turkey, though. So I'm curious to what extent this becomes, is this unproblematic, this position they have? Because I saw a similar comment being made by Sayyid Mohammed Marandi, who was pointing out that, the Turks didn't, while they spoke very loudly, they never did anything to support the Palestinians or the Lebanese. Meanwhile, now they're instead, launching these attacks against Syria, actually weakening Lebanon. So to what extent is this, you mentioned that the public, of course, is very concerned about the Kurds and this.
The Turkish public.
Yeah, Turkish public, sorry. Yeah. But to what extent is this seen as being problematic, given that, they're juggling all these different balls at the same time?
Very problematic. I mean, it's a big force. 15,000, some reports say. Big force with tanks, a whole tank division, all with the latest Western equipment, NATO equipment. This is a highly trained force of considerable size, and it's being taken on by the Russian Air Force. and the Syrian Air Force, who are bombing them, and they are suffering big casualties. But they seem to be, the last I heard just before coming onto this program was they were on the outskirts of Aleppo. They'd got that far. This is Erdogan has launched a major operation to disrupt Assad, to take territory and occupy territory, and for the Americans, because the Americans, these groups, the al-Nusra successor groups, I mean, which this is has been working with the Americans throughout this. So, their second job is to cut the supply lines and to attack. Already one Iranian general has been killed in this process. So as I say, this is really a very disruptive event taking place in this. And, Russia is bombing them with their air force really heavily, as is the Syrian Air Force. And the Syrian army is engaged, but they are well equipped, they have tanks, they have all the facilities. So we have to see what happens, but one should not estimate this. This is not a sort of little gang of militia, just sort of jihadists coming together in a group of 30 or 15,000 strong, something like that. Erdogan means business.
These jihadists only trained and armed by Turkey or United States, who are involved in preparing this, ground force?
Yes, they were trained by the Americans and the Turks together. That was during the period when it was, they were working together to try and overthrow Assad. So they were trained and paid for by the United States mainly. But this is a Turkish intelligence initiative, as I understand it, from the people in the region who are following it very closely. So it's another sort of front is really opening out because Syria and Russia are going to push back hard. The Israelis are talking now about trying to use the Kurds as another front against the northeast Syria, as another front against Iran and against the axis of resistance. So things are getting, not wholly unexpectedly, but when a war widens, it brings in, extraneous conflicts into it, and they sort of mesh in, and they can also mess up lots of things at the same time.
Perhaps we could discuss the Ukrainian situation, because in some ways, one almost feels that there is always a uniting thread between connecting all of these.
There is.
We have had a massive crisis. We had a decision which seemed to come out of nowhere, though clearly it was being flagged and prepared for a long time, to allow American missiles to launch American missiles into Russia. We've had this massive Russian reaction with this new missile system, which the Americans seems to have caught the Americans completely by surprise. We have all these talk about peace plans. General Kellogg has been appointed. The Russians have launched more strikes. They've claimed to have destroyed more ATACMS missile launches. I got the sense, I was listening to Putin. He's just been in Astana. He's given a big press conference there. He's made a speech there. He seemed to me to feel that he's got the situation pretty much under control. And the latest events, actually, from a military perspective, by enabling him to demonstrate this power he has, this military power, are working to his advantage, if anything. And I also got the sense that he's not in any kind of mood to make any concessions about Ukraine at all. And if the Americans think that, then they're sadly mistaken. What was your sense?
Well, I did watch. I can't watch it in Russian like you, but I watched it with translation, his speech, and I share the view. I think you have that exactly right. I think, you know, the West is trying to downplay the Oreshkin and saying, oh, you know, it's nothing really, it's not important, it's, you know, it's just sort of puff from Putin. It's not. It completely changes the whole paradigm because really, you know, for a long time, since Georges Canaan wrote the long telegram, the aim has always been to sort of push and push at Russia with the aim of sort of exacerbating what they believe to be the contradictions, the internal contradictions within the system, and to cause it to implode. And by the way, Atlantic Council now says we need the Georges Canaan model for Iran. So the things, you know, these doctrines don't go away. They just sort of stay on and evolve. And the aim has always been to sort of, you know, push, not necessarily to go to all-out war, but to push at Putin as much as possible in order to force him into a all-or-nothing trap. Either he has to agree to a negotiation which will serve America's interests. The outcome of it will be favorable to the United States, or he has to escalate, and to escalate possibly by nuclear. I mean, that was being discussed when I talked to several people in Moscow about that. And, you know, the question was, you know, the funnel for escalation against Western provocation was becoming narrower and narrower towards a sort of, at least, if you like, a small nuclear weapon, a tactical weapon, or something like that, as a demonstrative act. And so he was stuck in a certain extent in this sort of trap. And now what's happened is it's been completely inverted, because actually now it's America that is in the trap, because they can't now put an all or nothing pressure on Putin, because he has every ability now to react to provocations in a way that is going to be really painful for the West, even at their home, even in London or in Paris. I mean, not in a civilian way. He will not do that. But I mean, it's changed the whole paradigm of the whole Western thinking about, you know, the pressure, whether it is Russia, and as you say, do these things go in parallel? Absolutely, it does. And then Iran. And the greatest problem, I think, really, that both Iran and Russia have is this, you know, that underlying all American strategy is this simple proposition. We are strong, Russia is weak. Israel is strong, Iran is weak. And even though, you know, the facts on the ground, and if you study and you look at, I mean, anyone like you do, who've been looking at Ukraine very closely during this time, you could see what was happening. But it doesn't get through to the intelligence services. In a sense, you know, this conviction of superior technology, superior military. The American military is the best in the world. It isn't, but that's the conviction, and it's deeply held, and that it means that people are willing to ignore any data that comes in that says something different. And they just say, no, I'm not prepared to believe that. I think that's wrong. And they don't take it. And so really, you know, even with all that you can see and you've seen and what's happening in Ukraine, that Ukraine is quite clearly moving towards in the direction that's favorable to Putin and to an outcome that will suit Russia. Even though that is obvious, even months ago, it wasn't very long ago that we heard the head of CIA saying, "Oh, the Russian army is hopeless. It's poorly trained. They don't have equipment. They're running out of, blah blah blah." But the point was, they believed it. They saw that. There was a very interesting. I saw a very interesting article in the Israeli press where the former head of military analysis and research, Todd, he's saying, this was the problem about 7th of October. They just, yes, there were signs something could be coming. And he said, but no, they couldn't accept it because, his staff and his people said, but Hamas, no, Israel is strong and they are weak. So it makes no sense that they should do anything and attack us, come and attack us. Similarly, they don't believe Iran and the resistance really think that Israel can be imploded by attrition. And he said, and you know that even after the 7th of October, when all of our sort of structures of intelligence collapsed and were lying on the floor, broken, still people didn't believe it, wouldn't believe it. And he said, and this was his point, and my point too, it's cultural. It is a cultural thing. And one of the reasons I think for this is because, it's not just, because we've adopted the end of history meme and, liberal peace and that, which we have. But it goes much further back in the sense that we have this teleological view of the unfolding of history, meta-history, that it's all, linear and progressive and heading up to redemption or whatever you want to call it. But this sort of sense of moving in an inevitability was overlaid then by this end of history meme after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then became sort of embedded in it that everything is converging on, if you like, a Western liberal vision of the future for everybody. And so it's very difficult to break it. And that's the great thing about Oreshnik, is that it's, even people whose conviction remains, the United States is so strong. The expenditure on military is the same, equals, the whole world's military expenditure. We've heard all of this. But even then, they can't get it. And this is the great danger in Iran too. Perhaps even more so. Iran has made 2 demonstrations to show that they have real military capabilities that the West does not attribute to them, that they have real technical capacity, and that they have innovated, just as Russia has innovated a new weapon that changes the whole. Iran, over 20 years, has innovated a revolution in warfare, a different type of warfare. The West is stuck in the warfare of air dominance, absolute air dominance, and airborne firepower, masses of bombs. What we've been seeing in Beirut and elsewhere. 20 years ago, they started thinking, well, what do you do about this? How do you match it? And they've come up with a solution of how to deal with it, how to have, an air force without having an air force, how to deal with aircraft with different kinds of air defenses. So it's the same thing. And so, what Putin has done in a way which might even penetrate into Western linear teleological consciousness, that actually the paradigm has changed in Russia, and that it's necessary. And that's one of the reasons that Iran really is still contemplating another attack on Israel, because, what happened after the last one where they demonstrated it clearly? You have people like General Jack Keane going on Fox News and saying very loudly, and he said, the Israelis completely knocked out the air defenses. They damaged the program. Iran just lies naked before us. They are staggeringly vulnerable. It's pure fiction, just nonsense. But it's dangerous nonsense, because, he's a 4-star general and others say the same thing. And, these things just didn't happen. Take, for example, the great claim is all over. Oh, look, Israel knocked out this important research station, nuclear research station at Parchin, and set back the whole program. This is imaginary war. It's equivalent, really, to Colin Powell at the UN at the time of the Iraq War, getting up and saying, this is the proof you need of weapons of mass destruction. It's just as fictitious. Parchin, I've known it because, I was involved to a certain extent with this nuclear thing when working for Salam. Parchin has been inspected and re-inspected over 20 years. And I remember 10 years or more ago, the Israelis came and said, oh, we've got these samples of sand and it looks as if there's unexplained uranium deposits. IAEA came in, inspected, found no evidence, went away again. Then the Israelis said, look, they've laid a layer of tarmac at Parchin. There must be a secret bunker underneath where the researchers did. Back they came again from Vienna, inspected it again. And the truth is that any sensitive work was removed from Parchin in Khatami's time, years ago, and put deep in the mountains, in the big mountain bunkers where it is. There is nothing except run-of-the-mill standard sort of military, research and things going on for things like anti-tank weapons or something. Nothing to do with sensitive things at all. So all of this is fake. It's this sort of, and we are in this imaginary war. Because Netanyahu says, well, we won in Gaza, and now we've won in Lebanon, and now we need to win in Iran. And my only concern is what happens, if Israel does an imaginary war against Iran, claiming, bombing to bits Parchin. They didn't actually hit it with any ballistic missiles at all during the big air attack on it. Parchin is within visible sight of Tehran. And I know from people who watched it, there were no ballistic, detonations from ballistic missiles at all in Parchin. What we know was 2 buildings, the Ugal 1 and 2, were damaged, but my belief is that they were damaged by drones, and the same with the Sharor Center, about 1,000 miles from that border, which is the space center, and which was at a time that what they call the fuel mixing. I don't understand entirely, but it's for liquid fuel missiles and so on, mixing center, and that stopped years ago there too. And there was a witness there who watched what happened. So it was very interesting because his house faces north-south and overlooks Sharor. And he said, I woke up 3 a.m. and these 4 flying objects came over. two were shot down, and two landed, not with a great flourish. And he said, what was very strange was they were coming from the north. They weren't coming from Iraq. They weren't coming from Tehran. They were coming from the Caspian. In other words, these were drones, probably fired by the MEK, designed to give the appearance of some sort of attack having been achieved, because the ballistic missiles were not, I mean, they were launched, some of them, but I mean, mostly they only struck in targets right on the two provinces adjacent to Iraq. They didn't come within 70 kilometers of Iran. So we're in this time where these narratives and things become more important than facts on the ground. And it's very hard to persuade the West because I say, this sort of linearity and this conviction, deep conviction, which in a sense is eschatological, that the West, is on the path and the runway to paradise, and we're all going to follow in that path. It is very much difficult to get it through, and what Putin has been trying to do, and why he keeps coming back and saying, do you want another demonstration? I'm about to give you another demonstration. He's promised one at Astana, as you heard. He said, okay, because we've had they didn't stop. They didn't get it. Just the same as with Iran. They didn't get it. So what happened was there were several attack camps, many attack camps. He mentioned it. And fatalities and injuries caused, I think, 23rd, and then later you probably have better memory than me, when he said, and they've just continued. So there will be they're waiting for him to get back, and then he will order another attack, and he suggests it might be on Kiev or it might be on some other place. I do think that he's not going to play the American game. I don't think he's going to try and escalate it into something much hotter, shall we say. I think he will just keep the same process continuing. He's trying to manage the American psyche as much as the American weapons.
I very much agree that a key problem is that, we're becoming too narrative driven, of course, telling these stories, making it more difficult to relate to reality. But on this, I like the way you framed it as an imaginary war. But I think this is also a key problem with Russia. At the source or at heart of it, it seems that it's this repudiation that that the Russians are not fighting an existential war, which is causing a lot of the problems, because it results in this miscalculation. For example, the idea that if we just escalate enough, put enough pressure on Russia, then they, again, as you mentioned, will discover these internal contradictions and they will begin to collapse. Indeed, when Arestovich, the former advisor of Zelensky, argued in 2019 that Russia would probably be provoked into invading and then we would defeat him, this seemed to go along those calculations. But instead, we see that the security concerns which Putin have been uttering for years seems now to have been validated, as NATO is getting more and more directly involved in attacking Russia. And I think the same applies to the assumption of escalating. That is, if we're not buying into the argument that Russia's fighting war for its survival, then escalation suggests that the cost will go up, the benefits will go down, and the Russians will therefore back down, and also putting them in front of this dilemma: either escalate, risk war with NATO, or capitulate. But again, if they're fighting an existential war, then there is no capitulation. So it also, from this, seems that the Oreshnik missile, of course, gives them this very powerful third option. But do you see this again? Do you see this among the Western elites?
Yes,
do
exactly.
They actually believe in what they're saying, or is it just commitment to promoting a narrative, or they don't accept that Russia sees this as a fight for its survival?
Two things. I think, first of all, the first answer is because a few days ago, just after, well, it was actually the day before Oreshnik was fired, a vice admiral from Strategic Command that lays out the nuclear plans, you may have seen it, and he came on and he said very clearly, the United States is ready to fight a nuclear engagement with Russia and to win and to emerge victorious sufficiently to be able to fight any other adversaries in a nuclear exchange after winning it. I mean, you know, again, is that conviction, or is there how do they come to that sort of conclusion? I mean, it's obviously they believe that they can do a preemptive strike. That's the only way to understand what this Vice Admiral Buchanan was saying. I mean, and he's from Strategic Command and responsible for this planning. I mean, that's the only thing that they're absolutely convinced that, you know, America with all its strength and with its power will just come in with its nuclear weapons and Russia will be finished and America will have enough weapons left over to take on anybody else after winning. I mean, I just think it is fantasy, again, imaginary war that they're engaged in. And they say it because it gives them, you know, you get promoted for saying tough things like this, and you're taken seriously. And people who say, you sure? Is this right? I mean, get shoved aside and don't get their sort of second star or whatever it is. So I think that, and I do think, you know, you emphasize it, and I agree with you entirely. You know, these narratives have trumped facts on the ground. People are more interested in crafting and curating a narrative of winning than actually winning. I mean, sometimes they're losing, but they're still winning in the narrative. And I just don't think it's a very good way. And Buchanan's comments, by the way, electrified the Russian public. I mean, they said, many of them came from that and said, you see, they are intent on a nuclear war with us. That proves it. And so, it escalates it, and it escalates the pressure on Putin to be tougher too.
It's interesting because your point about the fact that they find it impossible to conceive that they can fail. Just yesterday, we were talking to Seven Dagdelen, who is a politician in Germany with Sarah Wagenknecht's party, which is opposed to all of these things. And I asked her directly, I said to her, do German political leaders, are they capable of believing, do they really understand that there is an actual process of deindustrialization underway in Germany? Can they conceive of that? And I got the impression, she basically said, no, they can't. It's not something that they can generally believe will happen. And if you listened to Robert Habeck, who is the economics minister of Germany, he says there's no cause for concern. Germany continues to be the world's third biggest economy, which it is not the third biggest economy anyway. But he is the economics minister, and that is what he says. And I really do wonder sometimes whether we've reached the point where the military people, the intelligence people, have the courage anymore to do what they ought to be doing, which is telling their political leaders what the true situation is, whether they've lost the ability to tell truth to power, which is what you are supposed to do. I would have thought if you are in a senior position in the military, defense, intelligence, foreign policy establishment of any country. I just wanted to say this. I was listening to Putin very carefully. He was making a lot of very, very, very interesting points. One of which he said was that in our anxiety, in the anxiety that Russia had to be embraced by the West, we made so many concessions that we basically gave the Soviet Union away. A person who says something like this, it seems to me what he's saying is, we've reached the limit. There are no more concessions we can make. He spoke at length about Angela Merkel in ways that I've never heard him speak before. The whole wretched business of the dog, the one that Hugh was supposed to have unleashed on her, which has been explained time again. It's a misunderstanding. And she trotted out the whole story again in her memoir that's just been published. And he was clearly very angry about that coming up all over again. I don't think he has any belief, any trust in the people he's dealing with in the West anymore. I don't think this is a man who is in any mood to make any concessions at all. And I don't think he feels under any great internal pressure to do that either, actually. And I think this is the other misconception, that there is within Russia, a vast number of people who want to go back to the way things were and who want peace at any price. I think there may be some such people, but I don't think that they exist in any politically significant way. And they make the same mistake, I think, about Iran. Now, about Iran, I know much less, but I think there is a belief that Iran is also a house of cards. If you knock it really hard, if you impose more sanctions on it, interrupt its oil, that it will come tumbling down. And I don't get the sense that's true either. But anyway, your thoughts?
Well, going back to the first thing you mentioned about it, you see, I think culturally, Putin is able to hear and to notice. We have two things that are really affecting us in the West, I think. One is this, alignment, whole of society alignment that has been sort of implemented since Obama's time, where we're all supposed to, go along with the same view. So that if you say something, to someone, well, I don't think Putin is, you can't say that about Putin. I mean, you can't say this about, Iran. I mean, there is, when the West don't bother with empathy at all, or trying to hear or listen to do it, because we've got AI, get enough data points and we can understand Iran, we can understand China perfectly. But those regressions that they use to do that smooth out and sort of give you a nice, linear sort of pattern when life isn't like that. And what it excludes is, it excluded the small things that are unexpected, unexplained, but meaningful. And, the most meaningful thing came, for me, was sort of listening, watching what was going on the sort of Israeli airwaves, when suddenly, in the first wave attack on Iran, there was the Israelis were saying, the pilots are reporting that they wwere 70 kilometers there far away. We've got lock-on, unexplained, unexpected air defense systems are targeting us. And then they scrapped the second wave, which was the one that was going to come in and do the heavy bombing. Now, just that one comment, this is why, I feel that we still go on seeing the world in a sort of Newtonian way, as a machine that, you've only got to get to the bottom of the laws and the patterns, and then you can predict everything clearly. And we don't seem to have understood that there have been other developments in physics, like quantum physics and chaos theory, which tells us something very different, that there may not even be such a thing as cause and effect. Because everything is intercausality, linked by causes. So, I mean, I do think we have this real problem with it. And it's in a funny way, it happens anyway. When we were living in Beirut, I used to take people, Westerners, many of them, to meet with Hezbollah. And I would sit through the meeting and they'd talk and they'd sort of argue with the leaders that they met. And at the end of it, they come away and they said, it was strange he said X, Y, Z. And I said, but he didn't. Oh, no, I asked the question, are you going to do this? And clearly, that was the reply. And I said, but did you not hear his story? There was a story attached, an allegory. And he answered you in the allegory, not in a yes-no form. He answered you by telling you a story. And I would say of all the people, the number of people who could actually hear what was said to them by a movement like that were very, very few, very, very few. They were just culturally blocked from being able to hear. It wasn't that they were, they didn't approach it. I'm not suggesting they were sort of deliberately doing it or that they were so hostile that they weren't. It was, difficult for them to, it's a failing of empathy to be able to listen and hear and take what people say. And, I know the Supreme Leader does the same thing. He says, have you read a book? There's this really interesting book. And some Lebanese came and they wanted him to disarm Hezbollah. And he gives the story of the end of the, cutting it short, but the story was about how, it was a sort of replay of that famous poem about the barbarians.
Gaddafi.
I think he's one of your people.
Yes.
And well, maybe where have all the barbarians gone? We need those people. They were going to be our savior in the end. So he read a little story somewhat like that. That was the end of the discussion. And, there are just different ways of communicating and listening. And we don't do that much.
And I think this is a key problem, be it with the Ukraine, Middle East, or with the economy. The narrative issue. I don't think people appreciate how important it is, because you really have to buy into the different narratives to be relevant, as you mentioned, Alastair, to be promoted or be allowed even to speak, which is why I also noticed in the Ukraine issue, even if you talk about, let's say, the solid evidence that the Ukrainians didn't want to join NATO before 2014, that Istanbul was sabotaged, the Nord Stream, the failure of sanctions. I often encounter that people often don't, even though they counter with facts which can't be disputed, the main response is often, well, why would you challenge the narrative? Because this is Moscow's narrative, this is ours, so you have to sign up for ours, otherwise you're taking the other side effectively. So it seems like we have decoupled a bit from facts, which is probably one of the sources of irrationality. But I did just one. My final question, I guess, was the elephant in the room, which is Trump, because a lot of the issues now happening both with Ukraine and the Middle East is the assumption that the situation will change radically after he's come to power. So let's hold out for another few weeks. But what do you see? How will the coming of Trump influence, both in terms of how the actors will behave before Trump comes into power, and also to what extent do we have any maybe too optimistic about what Trump can actually do once he's in power?
He's had an incredible effect even before he comes into power, simply by the way in which he has said very clearly that he just overturned, if you like, the master narrative of the West. The master narrative in terms of, that we are, we are heading towards this, and the West is there to guide you and provide it. End of history, peaceful, liberal peace, all of this. He said, no more forever wars, no more. Why should I intervene in these countries? I find it hard enough to manage this country, let alone try and take on managing a country like Iran or something. Now, whether he actually does that or implements it, it was like, in a sense, in a stuffy, sultry atmosphere, someone opens a window and fresh air blows in, saying something like that, and said, I'm going to get rid of the, whatever you want to call it, the interagency, the permanent security state. I'm going to get rid of them too. And people are going to be able to say what they think without getting censored or debanked or lose their jobs. And suddenly, it was the end of an era with a new era still struggling to be born. It isn't ready yet. It's not come out yet at Kazan or anything, but it's struggling to get out and coming. But he opened this window, and that had a huge effect. And I see the whole, everything is sort of in the process of inverting and changing. And in the region, it's so clear. I mean, how long ago? A little while ago, the Sunni Gulf states were, embraced by Washington, and Iran, which was the great power from the 19th century with the Shah and everything, from that period in 2006 with the deal between Dick Cheney and Prince Bandar, was the attempt to change the whole region in another direction and put the Sunni world on top and demote the Iranian world to being the Shia world, to being outliers. But it's quite difficult to do because overall across the Middle East, it's about 50-50 Shia Sunni. I mean, it isn't when you start adding in Indonesia and Malaysia, then the balance changes completely in a Sunni sphere. But the whole swathe of that region is Shia. And they have great differences with Iran. They're not proxies or puppets of Iran, but nonetheless, Iran is the mothership. It is the home of Shiism. So you're not, this is inverting, and people are becoming radicalized. And I think whether some months ago when I was in St. Petersburg, I was talking about it and saying to the Russians then, I thought a counter-revolution was gathering. I don't know whether it would happen or not, but I thought it was gathering in the West. Now, when I come back from London, people were talking to me about an awakening, not just in the Middle East, but in the West too, for different reasons, quite different judgment. But people are seething in the West and in the global South about women and children dying, and pictures of children with their limbs off and things like this. I mean, really angry, and it's changing the whole process. Now, I know I'm drifting from your question, which was, what will Trump? Will he be able to do this? I think it's going to be very difficult for Trump. I think unless he listens, if he goes in with the sort of, I read Art of the Deal. I know what he does is, he waves a big stick and he gets people in his team who shout loudly, we're going to bomb you. And then when he plays that for a little while, then he slips in behind and does a deal, after all the loud noises and the sort of clashing and waving of sticks and so on, like this. It won't work for diplomacy. It's maybe okay for business, real estate. I don't know. I'm not in that field, but it won't work. Now, if he listens, actually, Putin gave him the answer. Again, it's one of these things about can people pick it up or not? You will remember in that first speech, I'm sure, because I know you listened to that, Putin then said, at a point, he said, it was a great mistake to end the intermediate treaty. Intermediate missile treaty in 2019. I think America made a mistake. Well, it was Trump who did it at that point. Now, I think Putin is giving him a very clear signal saying, don't come here and tell me what to do with Ukraine and this and that. You come here and you say, now, Mr. Putin, I thought that was very interesting, what you said about the intermediate missile system treaty and about limiting it. Now, what do you have in mind? What are your thoughts about this? And how do you see it going on? And then afterwards, then, the conversation might turn to Ukraine, but, you don't go in like this, what's your bottom line? Come on, which way? Let's cut a deal. It's not going to be like that.
No.
But he's given. I think if he was listening, that was a plea. Say to me, that was an interesting comment. Maybe we should explore it. That's all, and then he'll get there. He won't get there by sending some general, I think, as his envoy to beard Putin in his lair or whatever he imagines. So I think it's going to be difficult, and in Iran more so because he was the one who murdered Qasem Soleimani, and it still rankles deeply. Not just with the elites, but with the people. He was, like a football star. He was, but he was, a man of the people, and they loved him. So he's not going to find it that easy to get over it.
Just to quickly say, I completely agree and endorse, having been involved in many, many commercial negotiations in my time. Diplomacy is nothing like it. If Trump thinks that this is about doing deals, that he is completely mistaken. Diplomacy is about dealing with someone who is always there. I mean, with a deal, you can do a deal and you can move on and you can find someone else and you can do more deals all the time. But diplomacy isn't like that. It's about having a constant conversation, coming to agreements, finding ways forward, sometimes managing problems. The culture is completely unlike. If Trump doesn't understand that, then he's potentially going to get himself into lots of trouble. And I agree, by the way, I think Putin, it was another very interesting thing that he said was that, when you ask me, am I prepared to negotiate? I always am. I have always been there. I've never set preconditions for negotiations. If you want an agreement, well, then I have my clear positions and my terms, and I've already set out what they are. It's quite different. I mean, because one of the things about the Kellogg report, it was all about saying that the report, the General Kellogg co-drafted. It's about trying to push the Russians into agreeing to negotiations. The Russians have never refused to sit down and negotiate. Again, it's something that in commercial life you sometimes encounter, that it's sometimes or in the legal world, that it's sometimes very difficult to get the other side to acknowledge that there is something to talk about. But negotiations, diplomacy, should be conducted, is conducted all the time. And I just don't think, as I said, that the Americans, at least this administration, this coming administration, Trump himself, despite the fact that he's been president already, has fully understood that. So unless you want to make an further observation about that, I have really nothing more to say. I think you've
Yes, I just have one
question.
thing.
Yeah.
I just have one thing to say. I agree completely.
Well, I also agree also with this, with your comment about opening up the window. I think that might be the greatest contribution by Trump and Vance. I even saw a speech by J.D. Vance where he was making the point that over the past years, America has been, bullying other countries, trying to lecture them, tell them what to do. Meanwhile, the China's been building roads, the infrastructure, bring people out of poverty, and this is why we're losing. And for me, this is was very crazy to hear, because of course this makes a lot of sense, but I didn't know we were allowed to say it, and I think we locked ourselves into very ridiculous and dangerous narratives, which there's no room for maneuver. And yes, Alexander pointed out this narrative also that we have to pressure the Russians to talking. I find this to be so strange, because for almost 3 years it was our politicians now who boycotted diplomacy. They didn't, no, not forget about negotiations, but even sitting down and talking with the adversary, as hundreds of thousands of people were dying. Nobody wanted to talk. It is quite strange. And then we say, well, we have to pressure the Russians to sit down. But I even asked Putin about this in Valdai, and he was, like, we didn't close our door to anyone. We are, ready to speak. So it's very strange to me that we keep spinning these narratives, and everyone have to pretend as if it's real. So I liked what you said about this, the fact that they're allowing now the discourse to open up a bit. I think this could be very healthy. Anyways, any final comments before we log off?
Just to thanks to Alastair for coming on our program again. It's always, it's very insightful. And I just wanted to say, Alastair, I think I said to you when we met recently privately, that when you disclosed your information some weeks ago about the Israeli strike and the fact that the Israelis was confirming that their aircraft were being tracked, an awful lot of people across the entire media space noticed. It was quite extraordinary to see the effect.
Well, I'm glad if a bit of reality permeates sometimes.
Thanks again.
But it's still a dangerous time.
No, very dangerous.
Anyway, thank you so much for inviting me. I have enjoyed it. I hope it wasn't too sort of removed from the nitty-gritty for your audience, but sometimes it's good to sort of try and dig behind and understand.
I was going to get exactly that point. We deal with the nitty-gritty all the time. Having somebody who could take an overview is very refreshing for our viewers as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.